Hey, this is a super quick video on MIDI, or Musical Instrument Digital Interface, to help a complete newcomer to production understand what it's all about. Firstly, I should say that what MIDI is in a complete sense, and the MIDI that you'll most likely come across when producing, are two very different things. You could think of MIDI as like a comprehensive language, but as a producer today, you don't need to be anything like fluent, especially if you exclusively make music within a computer. The language was created in the 80s to allow hardware like synthesizers and software like sequencers running on early computers and workstations to communicate, or more accurately, to be synchronized and controlled by each other. This meant that you could connect various synths to a sequencer of some kind and use that sequencer to play the instruments in order to perform or produce music. MIDI gave performers of electronic music at that time the ability to create immense setups with a ton of different hardware instruments, all working together as one. Nowadays though, with the abundance of software instruments available, which have all the same functionality as their hardware equivalents, but with the benefit of being digital and with a comparable sound quality now, fewer producers feel the need to turn to hardware, and similar setups can be created entirely within the computer. However, this has also led to the rise of laptop performers armed with only a mouse to navigate their epic sets. Additionally, doing everything within the computer does rob you of the joy of having a physical interface to work with. So it's very common now to find MIDI keyboards or controllers in producers' studios or live setups. These aren't instruments or things that make noises on their own, but just devices that transmit MIDI messages to other devices. So you can do things like play an instrument's sounds with their keys or pads, or tweak parameters with their knobs or sliders, to allow tactile control and expressive performance. So although these kinds of MIDI controllers are by no means essential when producing, you can just compose and edit parameters with a mouse, they give you the ability to make music in a more natural way, perhaps making use of any instrumental skills you might have, and can help to add a more human touch to your music, even if you're just playing simple patterns with one finger. These days then, a MIDI controller most often connects to a computer, normally via USB, where the messages from its various controls can then be received by music software and used to play different instruments, or also sometimes control other areas of the project, like the transport, mixer controls, effects, and so on. A lot of controllers also have automatic mappings and integration, so you just need to connect them to the software and set them up, and they spring to life and become comprehensive surfaces for operating almost any part of the application. This is particularly great when using a software manufacturer's own hardware, like Push for Ableton Live or Native Instruments Machine. And although I've only mentioned connecting to software so far, you will find a lot of MIDI controllers also allow you to connect to different hardware as well, which is done via conventional MIDI ports, sometimes also called 5-pin DINs, as they have 5 pins for relaying MIDI information. For example, a MIDI out port on a controller can be connected to the MIDI in port on a synth, and then used to send information from the controller to the synth. Or with the controller connected to a computer via USB, you could send MIDI from music software on the computer to the hardware synth via the controller. So it just passes right through the controller on its way from the music software to the synth. In this scenario, the controller is just acting like a MIDI interface, essentially. So MIDI control surfaces often give you the flexibility to create hybrid setups that include some hardware as well as software. But that's where things can start to get a bit more complex, particularly if you want to control or play different instruments simultaneously, like in a live performance setup, as you'd need to know a little bit more about MIDI and how it works. In those situations, for instance, you might find it useful to know that MIDI has 16 channels for sending messages, which therefore allows up to 16 different instruments to be controlled at the same time, that it sends synchronization data or MIDI clock to allow devices to synchronize with each other. One device, sometimes called the master, becomes the sync source, and everything else then locks to that, so that any rhythmic patterns they make will be in time with each other. And that master can be hardware or software, so it could be your computer, for instance. MIDI has 5 different types of message, from channel voice, for conveying real-time performance data on single channels, to system-exclusive or SysEx messages that manufacturers use to send device-specific messages to their own hardware. These are often used to update an instrument's firmware, for example. Still with me? Now, in case you're feeling a bit overwhelmed and intimidated by that, well, firstly, I apologize. But secondly, remember that a lot of producers don't know or need to know any of that. And that's absolutely the case when you're first starting out. Why don't you need to know it? Well, that's why music software makes things much easier for us. Most producers tend to only play or control a single instrument at any one time. So there's no need to set each instrument up on its own MIDI channel. You just have it on its own MIDI track and then hit record on that track when you want to play it. Secondly, software instruments automatically synchronize to your music software. So if you wanted to create any tempo-locked effects, you don't need to worry about MIDI clock or anything like that, because syncing is done automatically for you. And you probably wouldn't even be thinking about synchronization initially as a beginner anyway. And in terms of MIDI data types and messages, well, the only ones you'll really need to know about at first are MIDI notes and other related values, which you'll come across in your software's MIDI editor, or piano roll, as it's sometimes called. It's called that because it works in a similar way to the piano rolls, or long bits of paper with holes in, that used to be fed into self-playing pianos that you may have seen busting out some Scott Joplin in an old Western movie bar. The holes in a piano roll are very much like the notes in a MIDI editor, as they define the notes that the instrument receiving them will play, allowing you to make melodies or chord sequences with complete control over the timing and loudness of those notes. And these MIDI notes can be created by drawing with the mouse, or by being recorded whilst playing a keyboard or other controller. So with all of that context, you now know a bit more about the history and what MIDI is capable of, but hopefully realise that you don't need to know the vast majority of it to get into production. So you're now ready to learn about the bits that you do need, as we cover the basics of working with MIDI in music software, which we'll move on to in the next lesson. So I'll see you then. This lesson is from a completely free course on the absolute basics of music production, to help a total beginner get started, so that when you first start getting into producing, you've got a good understanding of the kinds of concepts and terminology that you'll be coming across. To gain access to the course, just use the provided link, which will take you to Producertech.com, where you can create a free account and then get instant access to the course without any further obligations. So enjoy the course, and I hope it gets you off to the best start possible.